Research Conference. Today I am delighted to introduce Dr. Zubin Eapen, who is an Associate Professor of Medicine at the DCRI. He received his medical degree from Duke University in 2005 and completed his internal medicine residency and fellowship in cardiology here at Duke. He's the director of the Duke Heart Failure Same-Day Access Clinic and director of Education IT Innovations in the Department of Medicine. Research conference today is a little bit like buying candy the day after Halloween. It's buy one, get one free. We also have Dr. Eric Eisenstein, who will be speaking to us today. He is Associate Professor in Medicine and Associate Professor in Community and Family Medicine here at Duke. He received his DBA from Cleveland State University in 1995 and has served as the PI for several Phase 2, 3, and 4 economic and quality of life studies in a range of therapeutic areas, including cardiovascular, emergency medicine, and pulmonary disease. And his primary research interests are in evaluating information technologies as interventions in healthcare systems. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eapen first, and then Dr. Eisenstein.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? So it's a pleasure to be here. We actually have a very, mixed platter of topics today. The whole idea really was to talk about innovation, not only here at the DCRI, but broadly across campus. And so Suresh Balu might also join us in the third segment to talk about the Duke Institute for Health Innovation and what they're doing. But what we thought we would do is try to weave this theme of innovation throughout the three talks, or maybe two plus a Q&A, to give a little bit of a sense of what we're trying to do around spurring innovation in the first half, and then in the second half with Eric talking about how we're taking that into execution and actually into the context of a broad study, not only in the DCRI but outside. So we'll try to do that. There's the CME credit code. So first I'm going to talk about the innovations group, and this is a group that we've had going for the last 3 to 4 years, and this is going to seem a little bit different from Eric's talk, but I think we'll try to weave the two together. Emily, you're not the only one with an analogy around Halloween. So this is like the day after Halloween. You're trying to decide between, the crackle or the Mr. Goodbar. You're not sure what to eat, but for this talk, you get it all today. We're going to try to cover a bunch of different things. We're going to start by talking about this innovations group, and I've been happy to work with Sarah Holleran, who's here, in this group recently. But this is really a group that's supposed to span the entire organization, and I'm happy to really talk about it here at Noon Conference, because we really want to think about how do we get faculty and staff involved in coming up with high-risk, high-reward ideas for the DCRI. These are all supposed to be mission-oriented around developing and sharing knowledge that's going to impact patient care. But it's also about really fostering a culture of innovation, and I think that's inherent to anything that we do as a research organization, right? If you think about us, we are research and development in a lot of ways, but we always need to think about how we might be able to do things differently. And Eric's talk is really going to tee that up in terms of how are we going to think about not only research differently, but how are we actually going to do care delivery differently as a result. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about something that's passionate for me in terms of how do we directly engage participants and patients in either their research or their care delivery. And I think a lot of the focus that our innovations group has had in the first few years is really about how do we do that. And I'll go through a few examples of that. Here are some examples of topics and speakers that we've had earlier in the year. And I put this up just to highlight the different kind of people who have spoken at the innovations group on a monthly basis, as well as the different kinds of topics that we've had. So for example, in the beginning of the year, we had Jeff Cloak come to talk to us about population health analytics. This is an idea that he's been working on here at the DCRI, and then got funded successfully through DHI's Innovation Jam to really get funding around how we might develop analytics platform for population health. And as you all know, Jeff is working with Mark McClellan and others at the Margolis Center to really think about how do you take some of these things into practice. We've talked about how we might work on using EHR data for clinical research itself. Amy Harris-Norda from DHTS came and talked with us about how do you build a case report form essentially within Epic itself. And I think this was an interesting way of directly taking data elements out of the electronic health record to populate eventually a study database. This is, I think, a key topic for us as we start to think about Eric's talk we had a medical student, Pierre Elias, talk to us about new innovations within Epic. One of the things that he specifically worked on was developing an automated way to calculate cardiovascular risk within Epic documentation. This is something that's in my notes now, and an easy way for me on every patient without having to do anything to automatically populate the note with CV risk. And I think this is going to be important as we think about what Eric's going to present in the second half of Million Hearts. So I'd like to come back to this topic specifically. We've also had local and distant startup companies come and talk to us about things that they are doing in other spaces, and I think this has been interesting for us. I didn't put it up here, but one of the companies that we had come at the latter part of last year was Automated Insights. Does anybody know who Automated Insights is? Does anybody play fantasy football? If you play fantasy football and you get a progress report about how you did the previous week, and you get a grade like D, like I do, then that's probably coming from a group that's actually here at the Durham Bulls Athletic Park in right field, and it's called Automated Insights, and they do natural language generation and prose around all the data that's collected about you when you're playing fantasy football. So throughout the week, you have a certain score that you generate by the players you play. At the very end, they come up with a nice report card that's in prose form about how you did. We had this company come and talk to us about how we might use this during the conduct of a clinical trial. So if you think about how we might be able to do risk-based monitoring or help sites understand how they're actually enrolling in the trial, we could maybe automate a lot of what we have from a data standpoint into prose that can help a site truly understand how they're doing in a clinical trial and engage better with us so that we enroll patients better. We had Janet Becker from our own faculty talk about the sixth vital sign. I'll spend a little bit more time on this. This is the first research kit study developed by the DCRI that is now live in the App Store and available to patients all over to help participate in a study about gait speed. And then we've had Michael Pensina, for example, talk about the Center for Predictive Medicine and what he's doing around predictive modeling, particularly with the healthcare system. And I think, again, this is an example of what Eric is going to talk about. As a research organization, how much value can we have to the care delivery settings across the street? And so a lot of the work that they've done around predictive modeling for sepsis and other conditions, I think we helped start here and disseminate. And lastly, Kevin Anstrom, who's here as well, has talked a lot about digital health. And I'd love to, if it's okay, give credit to him in terms of some of the slides I'll show later, because I think this is part of the opportunity I think we have moving forward. Not only using things like ResearchKit to do studies directly with patients, but really thinking about how do we take both PROs and quantitative data collected by patients and directly use that towards study endpoints. We really want to think about how do we move this from not only a forum where we discuss some of these topics into a body that is going to identify not only the opportunities but start to facilitate that into progress. And I think one of the things that we've done with this meeting so far is really get the right people around the table to think about this. But as you all probably know, Eric Peterson and the executive team are very invested in terms of how does DCRI really view innovation moving forward. And I think there's going to be funds available for all of us to really think about how do we do research differently in the future. We want this forum to be a forum for you all to present some of those ideas. So hopefully we can match that up with some of the funds that are now available for investment in innovation. So if you have ideas, this is my shameless plug, Sarah's shameless plug for the forum to be used by you to present some of the ideas. Feel free to email me if you'd like. We have several meetings available where we'd like to have you present ideas where you think you might be able to help the DCRI do things differently towards its own mission. Here's an example, I think, of how we've tried to do this creatively. If you've seen Shark Tank starring Mark Cuban and others, I think we've tried to think about how we might do this locally through the Devil's Tank, as we called it. And this was a fun event for us. I think we wanted to have an event that really fostered that culture of innovation that I spoke about, but also provided a theme around which teams could really coalesce and start to think about ideas that they could put into practice. So for this first project, or first Devil's Tank, we talked about having groups get together to really come up with research kit compatible projects where they may be able to have a study design that they could use to work directly with patients to collect data for analysis, and then to be able to work with our IT team led by Walter Kwiatek and others to develop out that application that would be the mechanism by which the participants would engage in research. And so you can see we've had people from our fellowship, we've had people from the School of Nursing, oncology, cardiology, all presenting ideas in terms of how they envisioned a research kit app idea moving forward through the DCRI. And this really led to what Janet successfully launched, which is called the Sixth Vital Sign, which was really to think about how do you establish norms around gait speed across a wide, if not global, population. And so there were various objectives that she put forward, but I think the important part was this is something that anybody can get from the App Store to start participating in directly. So now that you think, the DCRI relies on sites for many of their studies, now we can go to anybody who has a smartphone and be able to conduct a study directly with them, thereby maybe really scaling up the study population for a study. Obviously, there are biases involved in terms of who might participate in a study via an iPhone, but I think it's important to realize we can start to do things at scale directly with patients, and this was our first foray into that. I think the other important part for us is that the investment made by Eric and others really was around not only launching a successful research kit idea, but also developing our internal capabilities so we could do something like this the next time around. We had a lot of capabilities developed with Walter's team, not only from a mobile standpoint, but also from a web standpoint, to really start using what they learned in this first initial project and then move it forward into other projects that you might propose. So I think this is the kind of thing we'd like to do around innovations, is really incubate some of these internal capabilities that we can use for the future, and then have you all be able to tap into that. And I think that leads us to one area of focus that we've really been passionate about, is really thinking about how do you move digital health forward. And I think this is because this is a way for us to really think about how do you engage patients directly, either in their research or their care delivery. It's also because we know that a lot of patients are going out into the consumer space and using tools that may or may not be validated for their own health. And we've seen multiple examples of this happen. One good example that I like is the Instant Blood Pressure app, which was an app that said that if you would hold your phone to your chest, it would be able to read your blood pressure accurately. And I think the reality of this, it's the top grossing app for a while in the App Store, is that I think 3 or 4 out of patients who were hypertensive would not be diagnosed with hypertension if they used the app itself. So there's a real issue around both safety and efficacy of what consumers and patients might be using outside of our purview. And so I think we need to think about how do we generate the evidence for things that will be safe and effective in this space, and then think about how do we enhance what we're already doing, either in a care delivery setting or in a research setting. And I think there's some good examples of why we need to do this. This is from Kevin Anstrom, and I appreciate him letting me borrow this to show this, but Kevin and others in the room worked as the coordinating center for this study, the NEAT-HF study, which I think was a very interesting first foray into digital health as part of clinical research. And particularly because they start to use devices that patients can directly wear on their hip, and also start to measure more granular measures of activity in this study. So this study was looking at placebo versus isosorbide mononitrate in patients with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, to really see if isosorbide mononitrate versus placebo had a differential effect on activity. And I think what's interesting is that when you look at what they got from the accelerometry data, you can see that isosorbide mononitrate compared with placebo had a progressive and a dose-dependent effect on activity, such that higher doses of the drug decrease activity levels in the patients compared with placebo. This is not something that they saw when they used the traditional measures of having a patient come to a clinic and do a 6-minute walk test. And there could be many reasons for this potentially. You could say that maybe patients really put on their A game to come to clinic and really walk fast for 6 minutes, but that when you take a continuous assessment of a measure like physical activity, maybe you get more granularity around some of these data. So I think, when we think about some of the endpoints that we have used around things like functional status, we really have had only the tip of the iceberg view of what, patients are truly doing. If we think about some of these more continuous measures using accelerometers like Kevin and his group did in this study, we might get some better understandings of what patients are actually doing and whether drugs do or do not have an effect on something like functional status. Kevin, did I leave anything out, or is there anything else you'd like to say about that? Okay, wow, thanks. And so I think this has also been a way for us to springboard into a variety of relationships, and I think this is the other key piece for us. I think Erica is going to talk a lot about what we are doing, with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid services in terms of thinking about innovative ways to use risk models and implement that to affect patient care. But I think we've had a lot of other opportunities to think about what we might do with digital health. From those previous studies that I showed you, we now are able to populate our electronic health record with daily step counts, and we've received grants from the Duke Institute for Health Innovation to do that. Two DCRI fellows, Jake Kelly and Nick Weisham, led that. Kishan Parikhu's here is leading a project with Microsoft now to test a prototype of a wearable device that they have not yet launched, but one that they want to examine with us to see if we can non-invasively measure hemodynamics in heart failure patients. Mike Felker and others are working with the American Heart Association and funded by them to look at how we might be able to take some of those data, like physical activity, and start to provide personalized feedback to patients so that we can see with patients with diabetes and heart failure, for example, could you improve activity and improve their overall health? And we also have industry-sponsored studies, and Rob Mentz, Adam DeVore, and others are working with Amgen to think about how do you take wearable devices and really, again, get more granular and continuous data around something like heart rate, which is important for a drug like ivabridine, which modulates heart rate. So again, if you think about that 6-minute walk test and then compare that with continuous physical activity measurements and the differences that we saw in the NEAT-HF study, I think it's going to be interesting when they start using these devices post-discharge in patients on or not on ivabridine to see what heart rate modulation looks like. So hopefully more granularity around some of those endpoints. And then lastly, I think we have a great opportunity at Duke to really play a role here in digital health. And that's because we have resources locally as well as peer institutions who can work with us in this space. We are working with DHI, for example, and Kishan's project is an example of using our care delivery settings as a living lab to actually execute projects like the one with Microsoft. And we have peer institutions like Stanford and MGH who are interested in doing some of these studies with us. And our hope is that we can start to think about doing multi-site digital health studies, just like we did back in the day with Vigor and other networks, to really get enrollment quickly across studies that might be innovative and different for clinical research. And lastly, I think PCORNet could provide another good opportunity for us as we think about not only working with the CDRNs, but also the patient-powered research networks. This is a way to directly engage patients, again, in research, as Janet and her team showed in the Research Kit study. I think the other reason why we should play in the space is because we already know the development cycle so well for drugs and devices. And if you think about drugs and devices going from phase 1 to phase 4, I think tech companies, and I think Microsoft again is a good example, have devices where they need to understand, what kind of data are they producing, how calibrated are the devices that they're manufacturing, and do they actually impact outcomes? And I think if we translate some of that from our previous experience, we can start to work not only with pharma and med tech companies, but now also tech companies to do the same thing with their devices that will impact both evaluation and the management of patients in the future. And I think we are invested in trying to solve some of these issues in digital health, and we are holding a think tank under the leadership of Matt Rowe and others in December to really bring various stakeholders to the table to really think about what are the specific issues here. I highlight some of those around the lack of evidence around safety and efficacy for some of the consumer-facing applications of devices that are already out there. But a lot of these companies want to know how do they really integrate well in a care delivery setting and use devices that can move the needle on outcomes. There's a lot of regulatory issues, there's a lot of reimbursement issues I think we need to solve, and hopefully we'll do some of that at this think tank. So I hope this has provided a decent overview of what we're trying to do around innovation and maybe a specific focus in digital health. But to get back to that slide I showed with the calendar of events, I think we wanted to talk about how do we take some of the specific topics that are of interest to our faculties and our trainees and our staff, and they really move that into practice. And so if you remember what we showed around the automated calculation of cardiovascular risk, hopefully that's a nice segue in for Eric's talk, where he's really going to talk about how that might have blossomed into a much broader initiative and what they're doing now with Million Hearts. So I'll hand it off to Eric.
Okay, I'm going to have to get my presentation up here. First of all, I'd like to thank Zubin for his wonderful and kind introduction to this talk, and also for the opportunity to begin talking about the Million Hearts study just a little bit. For those of you who might know it, Million Hearts is it's probably CMS's first foray into this area. It's a large cluster randomized trial, and this should do it right here. Okay, CMS has been involved in this. It's a 5-year study. They are the coordinating center. Deloitte Consulting is helping them, and we're a subcontractor on this study. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to sort of go over the rationale for Million Hearts and how we're going to go about implementing it. And as Zubin said, talk about some of the features of this. Information technology use is somewhat different in the study than we've had in other trials. Since I've been at this institute, we've talked about using models. Well, we're actually using them now, and it's somewhat scary because we're using models to both screen patients for studies, calculate primary outcomes for our study, and also as the basis for a payment. We've also talked about reimbursing providers based upon outcomes and not based upon procedures and things they do. We're actually doing that now too. So there's some real changes here. And then our approach to in-trial monitoring is quite different from anything that we've done previously. So anyway, so what is the Million Hearts model and why is CMS doing it? So basically, their goal of this study is to reduce the incidence of first heart attack and stroke among high-risk beneficiaries by 7% within 5 years. So a high-risk beneficiary is defined as someone who has a 30% or greater risk of having a first MI or stroke within a decade. And for them, this is an important study because this is a model for them. They're testing their hypothesis for population-based care. This is really a population-based care study. So there are 3 parts in their model. First of all, they hypothesize that if they give the right kinds of support to sites, the support is models that they can use, the support is training they can use, it's also financing. If they provide the right kind of payments, then they will induce sites to change the way that they organize care and they deliver care for these very high-risk patients. They will use the risk calculator to actually calculate risk and identify high-risk patients. They'll use that risk calculator to suggest possible therapies for these patients, kind of therapies they should have, and then they will share this information with the patients in the office and then implement a team-based care model. And then 5 years later, they hope to see a 7% reduction in these hard outcomes for these patients. So what's happening right now? So the Million Hearts model is going to start enrollment in January 1st of 2017. So far they have sites in 47 states. They've got over 500 sites that have been randomized to either intervention or control strategies in this trial. And they've got 20,000 primary care doctors. The providers are largely primary care doctors who will be involved in the Million Hearts study. CMS estimates there's about 3 million beneficiaries that are covered by these 500 sites. And that in their work, they estimate that about 1/10 of those patients would be eligible for this Million Hearts study. We did some work for them earlier last year using NHANES data and tried to estimate on our own part who would be eligible for this study. So if you look at that line of risk score greater than or equal to 30, those are the patients that are eligible. And largely we're going to enroll patients between 65 and 79 years of age. So we're finding out that probably 20% of the people in a broad population might be eligible for this study. which is important. So we're probably going to enroll more patients than CMS thinks we're going to have in this study. The other point is important to look down to that line number 39 here. That's important because that's what the average risk score is for the population we are looking at in that 65 to 75-year age group. That's important because each site in the study will have an average risk score for all their patients in the study. To qualify for the big payment, you have to reduce that by 10% absolute value. So let's say that you have at Duke 5,000 patients in this study. You have an average risk score of 40. You have to get it down to 30 to actually get paid. That large amount. And you have to have a 2% reduction to get any kind of a payment. So a different kind of site payment model. And looking at the population by sex and race, these are also different than you would typically see in a cardiovascular trial. We're anticipating it's going to mainly be women. So if you look at this, so the largest group of people will be women. There'll be more women than men enrolled in the trial. But if you look at that risk score greater than or equal to 30 there, you see we anticipate we will enroll more African Americans than non-African Americans because of the higher risk scores, and also more men than women also because of the higher risk scores. So this is a different group of people than we've ever seen in a previous cardiovascular trial. So what are the different features of the model of million hearts, and how might that be different, and how that might also influence some of the innovative concepts that Zubin was just talking about? So thinking about this, it's a registry-based trial, but it's a different kind of a registry-based trial. When we do registry trials here at Duke, we start with a registry and then add things to it. CMS did just the opposite. They started with the outcomes here. So they have their outcomes, their clinical outcomes, which is their claims data. They've got the economic data, they've got the clinical data for the outcomes, and then they built backwards. So they said, okay, so this is our outcomes data. We want to do a trial here. We need to have a financial payment and a way of identifying how we're going to pay patients. We also need to have models. We have to have risk models, several risk models. And so they built the registry just to power those risk models and those payment models. So looking at it, there's very little data that's going to be collected actually in the registry. There's demographic data for the patients, some clinical data that will be collected. This will be collected every 6 months. We're also going to tell whether the doctor is going to say, did I prescribe statin therapy, hypertension therapy, or tell the patient to take their aspirin. So very little data, but it's going to add to the models to help us to be able to predict things that we're going to use in this study. In terms of the submission options, CMS has several options. Their goal would be, they have an interactive module so that if you're a physician in your practice and seeing your patients, you could enter data into the model interactively and risk stratify patients while they're in the office. The problem is that might interfere with some of the workflows and some of the practices. So they're anticipating also let people enter data into the registry afterwards. You can submit automated by a spreadsheet, or, and this is really interesting for a large site like Duke, there's something called the CCDA, or the Consolidated Clinical Document Architecture. All the 500 sites in this study will have EHR systems. All of them will meet meaningful use criteria. So CCDA is an HL7 standard. So instead of having people enter data into the registry, you can just automatically, through Epic at Duke, create the CCDA records every 6 months for patients, and then automatically load this information into the Million Hearts registry. So that means that both the outcomes data, the claims data, and the registry data can be collected without having research people actually enter data into systems. So what is the registry going to do? It's going to do 4 things. So the first 2 are going to be for every site, for the control sites and intervention, and the last 2 will be done by intervention sites only. So first of all, CMS anticipates that 90% of eligible patients at all sites will be in this trial. So it'll be a large trial. And then they expect to have 90% of the people in there. So 90% of the people, so all the people will be risk stratified. 10%, 20% of the people will be eligible for the trial, and then they'll get a payment for that. Then sites are supposed to use the registry to submit beneficiary data every 6 months. So all that data we're having, we submitted every 6 months. The sites also then use the risk calculator in the office or afterwards to calculate, and this is intervention sites, calculate the risk scores for the patients, and then use that to then actually manage patients in their practice. So manage patients according to the risk calculator. So about payments, so how are sites going to get paid in this study? So first of all patients, there'll be a risk stratification payment of $10 per beneficiary given for every patient that's enrolled in an intervention site. You risk stratify patients, enroll them. And then for the first year, they're going to get $10 per month for each beneficiary and enroll. That's $120 more. But after the first year, you only get paid if you reduce the risk level for your population of patients. So after the first year, if you have a 10% reduction in average risk or more, you still get your $10 per beneficiary per month payment. If you get between a 2 and a 10% reduction, you get 5%. If you get less than a 2% average risk reduction in your population of patients, there's no site payment that year in your patient. What they're paying for is outcomes and changes in outcomes of patients. So this slide just says that if you're in the control group, you're going to pay $20 per year just for data, for collecting data for the registry. So another thing that's unique about this study is that CMS wants us to use monitoring as a way of informing their model and maybe changing the model to optimize it in certain ways. Basically, their theory of change within this study, as I said before, is that if they provide the right support, participant organizations will change how they deliver care, and then they're going to reduce the risk of first heart attack or stroke and also be either cost neutral or cost saving. And so if you look at their own internal model of the project, they have what's called a driver diagram. And they're going to, and the driver diagram is going to start, as I say, with a calculation of risk in the practice for each patient. The practitioners knowing who their high-risk patients are and then managing those according to the model, using shared decision-making with the patients to get the patients incentivized to follow their prescriptions, and then for aftercare, establishing a team-based care model. And then between this and the outcomes at 5 years, there's a lot of things that CMS assumes will happen that are not necessarily explicit in the model. So we're going to make those explicit. When we look at this, we see several things that have to happen that we're going to be monitoring to actually make sure that this occurs. So we're going to be able to model that the sites receive the incentives, they receive the training, and we're also going to have data saying have they performed those activities in the driver diagram for all their patients. The other hypothesis, though, is that if they perform the activities, they'll be prescribed the correct medication. Therapies will get that from the registries, and they'll be adherent to those medications. So we've been told that 80% of the Million Hearts Model people will be on Medicare Part D. So we're going to have claims data supporting are they adherent to their hypertension therapies and their lipid-lowering therapies. Also, the model says that if they're adherent to their therapies, then we assume their risk scores will decline. So we'll be able to validate that risk score model and see if the model is working as we think it actually will. And then we're going to help CMS think about their per capita payments. Maybe that 2% and that 10% thresholds aren't the right thresholds. We'll help them think that out. Also, CMS assumes that if there's a decline in risk scores, there'll be changes in resource use. They're expecting major changes in cardiovascular resource use, which will lead to better clinical outcomes. And then they're assuming this whole model will either be cost neutral or cost saving. So I'm going to skip, and we haven't got much time, so I'm going to skip the reports. This is just what we showed CMS, overview of the kind of reports we're going to create. But I want to thank our team. We've had a great group of people working on this study for the first year. We're heading into the second year where our work is going to increase. I'd like to particularly thank Kathy Fox, who's here, who's our project leader. So that ends my part of the presentation. I think we're going to have an open chat with people about innovation and questions about innovation or particularly the Million Heart study.
This is about the Million Heart Study. I may have misunderstood, but it sounds like you said that you're predicting that by having people be more compliant to medications and things like that, that you will reduce their risk scores. But it seems to me that by definition, the risk scores will be reduced because they include those factors, right? So, I mean, wouldn't the risk scores include whether you're on a statin, whether you're on an ACE inhibitor or whatever? And so therefore, if more patients are on those things, then their risk scores will automatically, the score itself will automatically be reduced. The score is not dependent on what the outcome is because the score's already been created.
It's dependent upon blood pressure, it's dependent upon statins, it's
Right.
dependent upon a lot of things. Yeah.
Right, so if you increase the use of statins and other medications, then you have, by definition, increased the risk score. It may not change the endpoint at all, but it will change the risk score.
Okay, so you're assuming that physicians will prescribe the correct medications for their patients. You're assuming that patients will be adherent to those medications, right?
I'm just saying that you're saying that you guys are paying more because you've improved the risk score. But the risk score doesn't necessarily mean that the actual risk has changed.
Oh, yeah,
The risk
right,
score is
correct,
already preset
correct.
based
Exactly,
on things like
exactly.
treatment.
And so one of the questions we've had, so we think that that's a really good question. So we think that the risk score for risk stratifying patients is pretty good. The actual model to actually looks at reduction in risk score has not been validated that much. And so I think one of the things we're going to do in this study is really be able to validate that. And you're actually right. So we know, we have some thought that if you reduce the risk score, you're going to change the outcomes. We're not sure about that. So one of the things we're going to be able to do is we're going to have great outcome data on a large number of people and be able to see if each of these components are working. If you get the right medications, if you're adherent to those therapies, does the risk score change, and does that improve outcomes? And if it doesn't, we have learned something, sure. Great.
Can I ask one more?
Oh yeah, please do.
If I were crooked, which I'm not.
Yeah.
But if I were crooked and I were a doctor and I were involved in this, I would just give everybody really bad measures. No, I would say nobody's on medication, everybody has bad blood pressure and whatever.
Yeah.
And then I'd measure them later and I'd get my $10 per patient, right? So are you doing any sort of monitoring to make sure that people aren't playing the system?
That's also why Eric Yow's here. So that's one thing that really bothered. There is monitoring. They call it auditing. So there'll be some auditing at sites. I'm really worried about the potential for strange things happening in the data. One of the things we want to do is meet with Eric and be able to look at what are anomalous findings in the sites, things of that sort. There's no source document verification, nothing like that. That really worries me. So as a part of our monitoring strategy, we want to begin looking at that. I mean, I'm not that I'm scared, but I'm aware there's potential for things happening, okay? The one thing that is good, though, if you can get sites to automatically send records, send data from their EHRs, that'll cure that problem. So if you take the data directly from the EHR, batch load it into the registry, you don't have that problem. But I'm sort of worried about that small site or, whatever it is, yeah. Great question. Dr. Anstrom.
So, thank you, Eric. So, related to Karen's point, why was the decision made to reward sort of modifying the risk score versus modifying the outcomes, which could be adjusted for the risk score? So one of the things I worry about is you're almost incentivizing sites to get rid of older patients, because one of the slides you showed a big difference between, say, the cutoff of over 75 versus under.
Yeah.
What was the thinking there?
Okay, so basically, I think that the thinking was based upon the fact that the ACC-AHA risk score that's used for screening patients has only been validated for ages 40 through 79. So that's what they're going to do with it. But you raise a really important question. So CMS has said you don't have to have informed consent for this study. That's what they're assuming. They're assuming they want to get all eligible patients. So the reason for that, to have 90% of eligible patients, is so that you can't game it, so that you can't get only good patients in your trial. What they want is all the patients at your site. So they are making an effort to look at that issue in that way. Did I answer your question, Kevin, or not?
Sort of. I guess my concern would be over time you have a patient that might be a good patient, but they're going to age into a bad patient.
Yes.
Is there a correction for that, or that's just?
I brought that up the first time I saw this model. I brought that issue up. It seems to have fallen not on the ears that it should. The major risk factor is age in these people, right? If I'm going to stay for 5 years, I'm going to go from, say, 65 to 70. The primary factor driving my risk is age. And so the first time I was at CMS over a year ago, I brought this up. The person who developed the risk model acknowledged it and sort of didn't say anything. So I think we're going to have to think about that too, because I think that that's a really important issue. The other thing which is also different is that once you have an event, you drop out of the model. So, because you've already had an event. We're going to keep following up for outcomes, but you drop out of the model. So if people who are the sicker patients drop out of the model, that'll tend to lower your average risk score. And I brought that up at the first meeting. The physician who was doing the model acknowledged that it fell on deaf ears. You know, what can I say?
Is she still?
She's involved in the overall Million Hearts study. This is called the Million Hearts trial, which is a component within an overall really large study. Yeah. So she's on the advisory board of this or something like that. Yeah. But right, so I think that the issue that is being raised over here, this is what we were talking about. We've said you should use models in your studies, in your practice. But once you start using them, there's all kinds of problems that arise, or issues that arise. And your models have to be accurate, or else you're going to get the wrong patients, you're not going to pay them correctly, you're not going to measure outcomes correctly. There's a whole lot of issues there, right?
And tying it to financial incentives compounds.
Tying to financial incentives and compounds it, yeah. So I didn't put this in the slides, but we simulated also the model that's going to be used for benefits, calculating benefits, and we had some real questions about that. And we really did not think it performed as it should. We couldn't think of a better model to use for that. But we think it's overly sensitive, and it rewards sites more for changes in, say, blood pressure than it should, and those kinds of things. But these are the problems that you have, yeah.
Take Eric off the hot seat. Your question for Zubin. You mentioned the obviously explosive number of apps that are being developed to monitor blood pressure activity, other metrics. So can you talk a little bit about the regulatory perspective around this? Is there a perspective that any of this needs to be regulated, or is it sort of an impossible task, so it falls to the consumer to say whether or not something works?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the issues we're going to tackle at the think tank. There has been an increasing awareness that there definitely has to be regulation in this space because of some of these issues. And it's been interesting because there's various regulatory entities that may play a role in this. Not only the FDA, which probably is going to take the lead in a lot of ways, but also the FCC. And the FCC has actually been the leading entity to actually ask for some of these to be revoked or cease and desist in previous years. Now, having said that, the FDA has issued a variety of draft guidance documents around this, not only for what constitutes a medical device, but also looking at software as a medical device. In fact, at the last AHA Tech Forum that we had last year, Dr. Caleb spoke at that, and I think a lot of his questions were really around what constitutes clinical decision support. Because if you think about a lot of these algorithms, whether it's in a mobile application or if it's sitting behind an electronic health record and can actually render or influence clinical judgment, how much should those be evaluated? So it's really a big spectrum. This is not only about hardware, this is about software, and the latest guidance is on software as a medical device. But I think it's still early days in a lot of ways in terms of what is going to be regulated, but those lines in the sand are being drawn, and the FDA is being careful about how they do that.
Yeah, Kathy, yeah.
As a follow-up to Emily's question, it was curious to me, are we going to see a day when our cell phones are going to have to go through 510K approval and be substantially equivalent to a pacemaker or an IV pump or something like that?
You know what's amazing is that a lot of companies who are using a mobile application as a companion to a clinical grade diagnostic device are very cognizant of the fact that they may have to go through a 510K pathway or place some liability on the cell phone manufacturer if they were to use devices directly in the cell phone. And so companies are actually trying to work around the cell phone in a lot of ways, because once they make the cell phone as part of that, and they can't control some of that because that's made by Apple or Google or whomever else, there becomes a lot of other issues in terms of what the overall solution is. And so this has come up in terms of using the accelerometer within an iPhone, using the barometer within another smartphone. A lot of these companies that are developing devices that are dependent on those sensors are making sure that the phone is not considered part of the overall solution and therefore not part of the 510K pathway. So I think we could get to that future, but a lot of companies are trying intentionally to avoid that. Yep.
So I think it was last spring. There's an article in JAMA looking at Fitbits and a whole bunch of devices like that. I was looking at the accuracy of measuring steps in 5 minutes or whatever else it was. The accuracy varies greatly on those. I mean, some people would measure 500 steps, some would measure 400 for the same device. So is anyone looking at that issue? Because I think people want to, because there's a movement, I think, to let people bring their own into trials. Bring my own phone, bring my own Fitbit or whatever application is. So how do you manage that within a trial?
This is another challenge, and I think lately the consumer-oriented devices, I think, are feeling a lot of heat around this. Heart rate has become the latest metric to come under question. So there was an article in JAMA Internal Medicine questioning the accuracy of various devices, and there was a lot of variability compared with ECG detected heart rate. The other challenge is that I think a lot of people not only see the variability in the data that's collected, but they're also questioning the utility of the data. And so the other study that came out in JAMA recently was whether step counts from wearable devices actually had an impact on weight loss. And the headlines that came out of that were that Fitbits did not help you reduce weight, and if anything, it might hurt that. There's a lot of issues with the headlines themselves. So, for example, a Fitbit was not even used in the study. It was actually an old device that's not even manufactured anymore that's worn on the arm, not on the wrist, probably measures step counts differently, and was only worn, I think, for a few hours every day as opposed to most of the daytime, which is the way that Fitbit might be used. So a lot of these manufacturers are pushing back, saying, this is not fair to us. Our technology is evolving faster than your ability to evaluate it. So one of the challenges, I think, for us as researchers is really thinking about how do you create a nimble research framework to keep up with the technology that's changing, because it's not only the hardware that's changing, as shown in that study, but also the software algorithms underneath that is actually documenting or identifying what a step is for each of those step count devices, and that goes on for any other measure as well.
How do you do that? Because I think there's a real need that the technology is changing. I remember there was a kickoff meeting for personalized medicine. There was a big webinar given, and all the IT people were getting up there talking about stuff. So Collins, the director of the NIH, his first question is, have you validated these instruments? And the techies were saying, what? What goes on? And then you realize that's a multi-year process probably. So technology is changing quicker than you can get validated instrumentation. So how would you manage that?
I think a lot of what we're trying to do, and Kevin, feel free to speak to this too if you'd like. I think a lot of what we're trying to do is, again, go back to that drug or device development cycle, because yes, we need phase 1 studies, and maybe that's not really looking at dosing, but maybe around calibration of these devices. You need maybe early phase studies to look at maybe surrogate markers, and we've seen that studies that even do 3 to 6 month evaluations can be quick enough to show an impact. A good example of that was the Text Me study in JAMA, which showed text messaging had an impact across multiple cardiovascular parameters. And then maybe there's a larger phase 3 trials where you're looking at true outcomes. And that, I think, is a very difficult barrier to cross, not only because small startup companies maybe don't have the financing or the capital to take on a large study which really could determine the fate of their device, but also because it takes a long time for outcomes to be matured and collected for some of these companies who are moving a lot faster than that.
And
so
also,
that's the disparity.
And also medicine might not be their market. Like if you have a Fitbit or something like that, medicine or medical trials is a very small portion of their market.
And I think that's why we've seen so many issues in the consumer space being really focused on fitness and wellness. Because that's very different from having a clinical impact on a patient population. And so a lot of people see that as the big opportunity. You know, you think about healthcare taking up as much as 20% of GDP. All the tech companies want a piece of that.
Yeah.
The challenge is how do you make that jump into the clinical space? And I think people haven't figured that out completely. Our hope is that we could help them do that.
Yeah.
But part of the challenge is figuring out some of these issues with matching up the research pace with the technology pace.
Interesting area,
Yeah.
really interesting area.
Well,
Anyway, I think too, there has to be a better sense of when to stop, because, you know, ultimately, particularly in behavioral type things like weight loss, smoking cessation, some of these other things, you know, the technology is being used as a tool to affect behavior, and we need to sort out, is the reason that we're either seeing a variable effect or no effect because the calibration and the granularity of our measurement, we're just missing it? Or is it just that, you know, in the case of some of these accelerometers, there's something else behaviorally going on? I mean, they've showed that actually when people, you know, when they look at the NEAT, the non-exercise activity, the overall activity for people who, you know, exercise very strenuously, if you look at their 24-hour compared to someone who's just an active person, it's sometimes lower because there's this sense of, you know, well, ooh, I worked really, really hard for an hour, so then they just don't move the rest of the day. Whereas the person who's, you know, gardening and walking the dog and just kind of, you know, moving a lot, so that the overall activity is actually lower for the person who didn't, you know, formally exercise. And then the whole sense of, you know, rewarding your exercise with food, so, you know, you negate the calories. And I mean, there's a lot of behavioral things that no matter how you measure the exercise, whether you just use, you know, a notebook and say, you know, walked 10 minutes, you know, X number of, you know, miles, versus, you know, accelerometer or some of these other tools. I mean, I think sometimes we have to let go. It's not the tool, it's that we're missing the bigger behavioral message. And I think that's different. And then, well, we think there's something here, but we really need a better way to measure it because we're missing out on this, sort of like the nitrate example where, yeah, there really was an impact, and because we had a very poor measure, we were missing it, and this is probably impacting people's, you know, quality of life and their activity, et cetera. So I think, you know, models to better sort out when you're just totally on the wrong track and, you know, you don't need a better, you know, measurement and models when it really is the measurement, something's there, and I think that's a challenge too.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some really good points. That's a lot of what people were speculating around that Pittsburgh study, around the Fitbit or the armband being used around weight loss. People were maybe saying, oh, I did great, and so maybe I'm going to eat differently. Maybe that really changed the overall weight loss impact in the intervention group versus the control. And I'm not a behavioral expert, so it's difficult, obviously, to really get your hands around what that might be. But I think it also speaks to the fact that these interventions can't be used in isolation. And one of the things I think we need to do as both researchers and clinicians is really think about how do we integrate that into a practice. So for example, cardiac rehab might be a great example. You may use these devices to really think about measuring activity in a patient post-MI, but then you can integrate that or use it in tandem with counseling so that somebody is really following up on the data and making sure that it's not only about measuring physical activity, for example, but also looking at weight loss, looking at blood pressure, looking at other parameters so that there's more of a holistic approach. I think the challenge right now is we have very univariate approaches with these devices. It's either step count or it's heart rate or it's something else. We haven't really put the picture together around the patient.
I'm just smiling because she's describing if we can figure out patient behavioral change. I mean, that's the Nobel Prize, right, or the Holy Grail. I wondered if anybody had read The Patient Will See You Now, Eric Topol's new book. Anybody?
No.
It's got a lot of what we're talking about and looking into the future. Sometimes he's really right and sometimes he's really wrong, but he's always interesting. And it really talks about looking at payment structure changing in the obsolete patient visit to a doctor's office in the future. It's very interesting.
My question is, can you get the patient to accurately measure blood pressure, those kind of things? So I saw one of his, I saw an Eric Topol video years ago. I got my iPhone out, got the app on it, blood pressure measured, you know, daily for a month, and it didn't change. So I stopped it, you know. So in a clinical trial, how do you incentivize patients, how do you train them to get accurate measurements, first of all, and then to keep on doing that, like in a 5-year blood pressure trial?
Oh,
Something
no,
like,
I'm totally with you. Just goes along with the vein of what we're talking about. And we have a hard time getting our Duke clinic technicians to monitor the blood pressure
Right.
accurately. I mean, whenever I go get my blood pressure, I'm teaching them, you know, where your arm needs to be.
Yeah, that kind of
So
stuff,
the
yeah.
patient themselves are counts.
Boy, good question, yeah.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, everyone.